So my fascination with Christie has continued all these years, and I've read each and every one of these books. So I feel that I'm somewhat qualified to talk about this. What happened? Here we are. So just for your information, Agatha Christie is not just popular in Britain and the United States, but she's very popular in the world, particularly in former British Commonwealth countries like India, Pakistan, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Malaysia. And she has outsold everybody, including William Shakespeare. Now, of course, Shakespeare has about 300, 400 years, so we'll see whether Christie lasts that long. But I'm going to go ahead and get started on this. I'm going to share my screen with you. I'll speak for about 35 odd minutes, 40 minutes, and after that we can have a robust question and answer, or you can dismiss me on the way. In any case, I'm the happier for having talked about Agatha Christie with anybody, and so here we go. Okay, so I always begin with this. I believe that the British Empire was a terribly exploitative organization which brought untold miseries to millions of people, but its best legacies were cricket, custard, and Christie. And when I talked to Jen Camden about it, she said that she agrees with me on at least two of them. I'm aware that cricket is not really looked upon with favor much in Northern America, but it's part of the British Empire and its traditions, which is what brought Christie to so many of us. And a little brief bio. You probably know some of this already, so forgive me, but I just like to set this up in advance. Agatha Christie was born to an American father. Her name was, her maiden name was Miller, but of course they were settled in Devon. She grew up as an English girl, and she grew up at a time when she was English. The idea of being British was not so strongly established. England was dominant then as it is now, but the nomenclature used was English. She was educated at home and then at a finishing school in Europe in Paris. She joined the VAD, sort of nursing organization during World War I, where she learned a lot about pharmacology and particularly poisons, which she proceeded to then liberally use in all of her books. She also took time to marry Archibald Christie, who was a colonel in the then Royal Flying Corps, which has since become the Royal Air Force. She married him in 1914. She published this book, Styles, The Mysterious Affair of Styles, which I believe most of you have read, in 1920. But she was divorced by 1928, marrying later archaeologist Max Mallowan in 1930. Her marriage to Max Mallowan, the famous archaeologist who was quite well known in his field, also gave her a lot of opportunities to go out into Northern Africa and the Middle East and do a lot of go on sites at digs, and she incorporated them into her books, most particularly in Murder in Mesopotamia, a little bit in Death in the Nile, also Appointment with Death. And then finally, she wrote a book based on what she had read from her husband's works and being on these digs. She wrote a book called Death Comes as the End, which is set in Egypt 3,000 years ago. She produced The Mousetrap in 1953 as a birthday present for the Queen, as the longest running play in history. And she topped off a glorious career by passing away in 1976, by which time she was the world's best-selling author, having overtaken Shakespeare, and the most translated author. It's been very surprising to me to find people from places where English hasn't been used. It's not the native language, or it's not even an official language, but they've known about Agatha Christie, and they know about at least one of her detectives. Usually it's HERCULE Poirot. She wrote 80 books or book collections, some of them short stories. Some of the short stories you will find expanded into a book later. These recognized characters such as HERCULE Poirot or Miss Marple. And then there were none, sold 100 million plus copies, at least according to the Agatha Christie Foundation. It's probably the top fiction book ever. And she also, well, a little about this book, by the way. And then there were none was published under two names, both of which were deemed politically incorrect. The second one being 10 Little Indians. And after that, they just said, let's do away with the whole thing. My only problem with the title is that it seems to give away a bit of the plot, which is unnecessary. They're still making films on our books. As some of you might have seen Murder on the Orient Express. I didn't like it. I'm a traditionalist. I like the 1974 version much better. It was much closer to what was happening. Christie came of age in the golden age of detective fiction. We believe that the detective fiction, while it was established early on in the 1800s, and you have Edgar Allan Poe, and you also have Arthur Conan Doyle creating this genre. It came into its own, became a big thing in the 1920s and 30s. And it was essentially British detective fiction, which led at that point, was really very popular. There's also the American detective fiction, which was more about hard-boiled detectives, not very sophisticated, a little more violence out there. British detective fiction was different. This is also very different from Nordic fiction, which tends to be of the kind, the girl with the dragon tattoo. There is a lot more violence. There's a lot more crudity. There's a lot more torture out there. None of this exists in British detective fiction. One other thing before I go ahead, the Agatha Christie's conventions and traditions seem to have cast a shadow over most of British detective fiction. What do I mean by that? I mean that when Agatha Christie did this, nowadays you see other TV shows written by other people. So the Father Brown mysteries are fairly popular if you can get them on Amazon Prime or you subscribe to the BBC TV shows. But Father Brown, the way it has been remade into a TV series, looks much more like an Agatha Christie thing. It's not got any of G.K. Chesterton stuff in it. It looks much more like Agatha Christie, which is why I enjoyed watching it a lot. But Agatha Christie's style of closed spaces, of murders taking place, has now been transmitted to other works in this whole genre. Now, she was not the only one. In the 1920s and 30s, there were at least 3 other women and numerous other men who were writing. The 3 other women tended to be, were Marjorie Allingham, and there was Dorothy Sayers. And there's also Josephine Tay, who wrote a bunch of books, and she was writing about some of this stuff. So Christie, but she led the pack. Christie was very, very popular. Most of her books tended to have a rural setting, particularly in the 1920s and 30s. Later on in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, urban settings or even international settings became more popular. But in the 20s and 30s, it was mostly British villages, occasionally London, and sometimes the French Riviera, places that Christie was familiar with herself. The Butler never did it. That was a convention. There's this idea that the Butler did it is actually something that happens. No, butlers did not commit crimes. In Christie books, they were very respectable figures. Most of our detectives were amateurs. There's very little evidence of having a proper detective, someone who's in the police force. So the modern detective drama about the police procedural was not something that Christie wanted. She was writing in the era of the gifted amateur, and even Hercule Poirot, her main detective, while he did serve in the Belgian police force, he's making his mark as a private consultant. I will talk a little more about the centrality of class structure later on, but there were lots and lots of servants. There are there's a whole class structure. In fact, the book that you've read, Christie commented on that many, many years later and said, I was so horrified to find so many servants. There were undergardeners, there were chambermaids, there were housemaids, there were scullery maids. That sort of disappeared as you come down to the 1960s, where social change takes place. But Christie never seems to have given that up. She always seems to be looking back at, oh, those were wonderful days, which they presumably were for people who could afford that kind of lifestyle. It probably wasn't for the servants themselves. And if you've seen the film Gosford Park that came out in 1990s, it shows that the servants did not have as romantic a view of life in a big manor house as the people who owned it did. There's not much violence there, but a lot of murder. Christie, it was called the Duchess of Death, among other things. There's always a murder. Sometimes the murderer gets cocky or gets ahead of himself and they start killing more and more people. There were no feminists. There were no people of color. Well, there are a couple of them here or there in later books, and they always come across in positions of no power. They are incidentals, they're props. Sometimes they're just to be made fun of. No communists, some homosexuality that is alluded to, but Christie played it to the mores of her time. She was someone stuck in a long time back, and that's the way she did it. Later years, post-1945, you see shrinking domestic staff. You see that it's become a little more urban. There are more cars now. People live in London a little more. People live in flats rather than huge houses. Of course, there are still people complaining that you don't get very good domestic servants now, but by the 1960s, this was disappearing. I think Christie found it difficult to relate to this new world, but she wasn't the only one, of course. There were lots of other people who were doing something similar. James Bond's creator, Ian Fleming, notably in the film Goldfinger, had made a comment about the Beatles being something like drinking warm champagne. So that was the attitude of the time of people who had grown up in the 1920s and 30s. For them, this modern Britain was something they despised utterly. There was more women began to make their appearance in later stories. Some people of color did come in, but as I said, it was incidental. In one of the books, which is set in a Caribbean island, one of the characters who is involved, has a bit of a role, is a woman of color, but nothing substantial. Agatha Christie could never get over stereotypes. Her stereotypes of Americans are almost laughable in the 1920s or 30s. It's odd considering that her own father was an American, but she doesn't seem to have, and she had traveled around the world in the 1920s and 30s. Christie had traveled around the world, but she doesn't seem to have ever gotten a feel for what it would be like. The Europeans in particular, she has this thing for the French. They are voluble, they're excitable, they show their Latin temperament, as do Italians. The British are much more phlegmatic, measured, and I suppose that was the Christie showing herself. Even though this is not very nice in a way, I always enjoy reading this kind of stuff because it gives me an insight of what this particular class, this social class, thought about everybody else in the 1920s and 30s, and even later. Some of this, you find overtones when you talk to some of the senior people, and they still have it, people who are maybe just 10 years older than me. And in the later years, Christie never failed to mention people from the past. Her characters got older as a whole. There were some young people there, but now they appeared to be stage props, or they were the people, things happened to them. Christie was going back into the past. She would talk about, oh, well, that happened when we went to India. I remember going to India as a kid, her character would say. Many of her characters, including the detectives, were now in their robust 70s. And I think that's a good thing, because one of the things you don't realize is not many people have active roles for older people. Christie did. Miss Marple is a detective, and she's going about figuring out stuff when people at her age, in most TV series today, no one has anybody who's older. They don't have that happening. So let's look at Christie's world. A closed circle. There are family and friends. No outsider, no tramp, no gangs, no random killers coming in. Nobody got angry and just started firing guns. No, it's somebody, a known person. And even servants are not allowed to commit crimes because they are outside the group. There is a close circle of people who interact with each other in a finite space, in a house, in a train carriage, in a Swiss chalet stuck in a snowstorm, on an island, and in an isolated Egyptian house 3,000 years ago by the side of the Nile. So this is classic Christie setting. This is an enclosed space, and the characters cannot come in. Nobody can come in sometimes, nobody can get out. And so somebody here must have done it. So it's essentially limiting the number of people that have to be investigated, unlike, say, an episode of the Law and Order series franchise, where it could be some random person who came in, you have no idea, you have to look at street cameras. And of course, Christie was the highest level of technology they were using was fingerprints. There's a lack of violence. I've mentioned this before, but you don't actually see people grappling with each other, fighting, stabbing, none of that stuff. All that you see is the crime has taken place. You might hear a gunshot and find somebody is dead. You very rarely find people who are moving about, gasping for breath or something. It happens in mysterious affair styles, but usually victims of murder are dead. You don't have to sample that horror that's taking place. Christie also had a lot of literary allusions. I have to say that I was very much taken by by some of the ideas, the titles of the books. Taken at the Flood, for example, is from Shakespeare. It's from Julius Caesar. 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe, Hickory Dickory Dock, and Pocket Full of Rye are nursery rhymes. The Mirror Cracked is, I believe, from Tennyson. And The Pale Horse is from the Bible. By the way, for whatever reason, the American titles have got are very unimaginative. So Murder on the Orient Express, what a fantastic title. It takes you immediately to the 1930s. You're going in a first-class compartment and they're ringing a gong and saying first service for dinner. Instead, they made it Murder on the Calais Coach. Calais Coach sounds, I don't know, very coach class. Taken at the Flood, that's fantastic. It became There Is a Tide. There Is a Tide sounds like something you're hearing on the Weather Channel. So I was wondering, why is it that the American publisher of Christie's books would deliberately go out and get the worst possible title that you can think of? Finally, before I go on my mini rant about this, one of my favorite books is called 450 from Paddington. Again, the romance. 450, 10 minutes to 5, you take a train out of Paddington. The American title of that book is What Mrs. McGillicuddy Saw. I mean, seriously, why could they not come up with something? Stick to the old imaginative thing. Anyway, Christie is more a person of reason. Action does not happen there. People don't go running up and down chasing. The criminal is overpowered very quickly or just says there's no point in arguing. At the most, call somebody, you interfering jackknife. Why did you say this? And it's over. It's the end. And of course, there's always the thing of romance in Christie's books. There's an incomplete love story that has to be fulfilled. In fact, there's a series of books, which I will talk about in a bit, where the main character, the main catalyst is Harley Quinn. He's a kind of character. And they are all of those mysteries are to be solved because people who are a couple that's been separated can get together again. Before we go any further, there are a few Christies that I am ambivalent about. Most of them I like a lot, but these are some of my favorites. The Mysterious Affair at Styles, even though it's a little long and drawn out, it's the first one, and you get a sense of Christie and also England in World War I in 1916, with wartime rationing, with the class system at its height before World War I knocked on it a bit, and then World War II brought it crashing down. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is considered to be a classic for all kinds of reasons, but you'd have to read it until the last page to find out why. It is also famous for the time when Agatha Christie's husband had separated and asked her to give him a divorce because he was going to marry someone that he had fallen in love with, and she disappeared. We don't know whether she did it on purpose despite her husband or whether she actually had slipped into a mental stage where she could not figure out what was happening. But she registered in a hotel in Harrogate under the name of her husband's mistress, and she was missing. Her car was found somewhere, people searched for it, and later on when she did appear, people thought that maybe this is a publicity stunt for the murder of Roger Ackroyd. In her autobiography, she mentioned it as, I have no recollection of what happened. I suppose I must have been very upset. We'll take it at that. Murder on the Orient Express, I already talked about. It's a fantastic book. If you want an idea of what life was like then reading that book gives you an idea. When I went to Istanbul a few years ago, I went to the hotel and they have a room there which is called the Agatha Christie room in the hotel. People go and duly take pictures out there. That's where the book begins. in a way where the journey starts off. I don't have enough money as a professor at the University of Indianapolis to be able to take a journey on the Orient Express. So I shall either write a best-selling book of my own to make that money or do some kind of a drug deal, because that's the only way one can get on the Orient Express first class nowadays. It's a shortened journey now. It doesn't go all the way to Istanbul. It goes from Venice to Paris. Murder in Mesopotamia was the old name for Iraq. It was a sort of British colony, a mandate under the old League of Nations. This is the first of her dig books where the whole thing is set around archaeological dig. Death on the Nile is interesting because it's a journey on the Nile. It's romance, being abroad, and at least 2 or 3 relationships out there. I think Agatha Christie threw the romance thing on really thick on this one and said, we're going to see a lot of people fall in love and some of them will at least find some happiness. And then there were none, I talked about it, on an island. NRM is one of my favorites because she doesn't do this very much. NRM is about 2 detectives who are young, carefree, and now they've become a little older. They're facing middle-aged, and it's set in World War II. So it's actually a little bit of a spy caper, but there is still detection there. Who is the person? How do we identify them? Death comes as the end. If you wanted to know what life was like by the side of the Nile 3,000 years ago, read it. And one of the things I like about Christie is how she manages to convey that human emotions and experiences and jealousies and things like that, they remain constant over time, and how they drive people to commit murder. And it's very intelligently done. I thought that was well written. I read up a bit about it to find out, did she get things right? And yes, on the whole, she got a lot of stuff right. A murder is announced. This might well be my favorite book, even though it's not my favorite detective. It's Miss Marple. I find Miss Marple more than a little annoying, but it was very intelligently done, extraordinarily intelligently done. And it's post-war Britain, where Christie is actually describing things, how there's a shortage, how people use their food ration stamps to set up a little illegal black market to trade stuff with each other. And it's also got the only mention, one of 2 mentions, sorry, of homosexuality. There's a lesbian couple there, and Christie talks about it not openly, obviously, but it's fairly clear. And I thought that that was Christie showing a departure from, we are all one kind of people, upper middle class people who do not show anything, no public displays of affection, no sexuality, we don't talk about anything. Here's an interesting departure. 450 from Paddington. The interesting part here is the murder. We don't know whether it took place or not. So there's an investigation to find out if a murder took place, and if it did, what happened. So I think that the fact that it was set in a railway line is also interesting to a lot of people like myself who like trains. Cat Among the Pigeons, a spy story of sorts. Christie, probably influenced by the James Bond craze that was sweeping Britain and America in the 1950s, wrote this, but it still remains about detection. It's got a little more action. It's one of the few books where someone actually fires a gun. So I thought it was interesting. And 1969, a fairly late book, Halloween Party, in which there is a woman who plays Christie. One of Christie's characters throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s is Ariadne Oliver. Mrs. Oliver is Christie writing about herself. She's an absent-minded woman. She doesn't take care of her hair very well. She eats apples all the time. She's a detective fiction writer. And her detective is a Finn, and she hates him. Agatha Christie had referred to her creation, Hercule Poirot, as an egotistical creep, and she said she could not stand him. And so, pardon me, I think I've somehow managed to skip this. I don't know what happened. Here we go. I'm trying to get back. Here we are. All right. So these are some of the better ones. Of course, people have different ones. There are other ones that I've equally enjoyed. I brought these in because I think they represent the best of Christie, and they go over a period of time. She has Some people like the book Curtain, which was released in 1976, about the time Christie died. I don't like depressing books. I like books where there's a resolution, but that was considered to be a good book as well because the ending was so unexpected. The Master Detective, Hercule Poirot. Nowadays, whenever you watch any kind of show on TV, which is about a master detective, you are looking at an amalgamation of two characters. One is Sherlock Holmes, who remains the master, and the other is Hercule Poirot, who in his own mind was the master. Both of them are eccentric. Both of them use reason and order, and they deduce things. Both of them rely on their knowledge of the criminal mind and psychology. The Poirot, he uses it much more than Holmes. Holmes is much more likely to go for clues. He was an interesting person because he was a Belgian refugee. In World War I, a lot of Belgians had escaped German domination and come to live in England as refugees. Christie had run into some of them. She based her first detective on one of these. She gave him a sidekick. It was sort of the done thing at that point. Intelligent detective, you've got a stooge. And the whole point of the sidekick was that you got to show the detective, if the audience felt stupid, they would always feel that there is somebody who's more stupid than we are. It's okay. Poirot was crazy about law and order in everything. He did not like eggs being oval shaped. He would have liked them to either be completely round or to be in cubes. He always talked about the gray cells, referring to the matter, the gray matter in the brain, how they should be exercised. And he's always contrasted with Arthur Hastings, who was a sidekick in many stories, and then there were other people who came by who wouldn't understand. One of the problems of much of this detective fiction is whether it is Poirot or whether it is Miss Marple or anybody, there is no revelation of the process. That comes together only in the end. And the problem with something like this is, what happens if the detective gets killed? No one knows what's going to happen. This does not happen in police procedurals, but of course, for the sake of drama, it was necessary to do this. Poirot is able to get people to talk. His idea is that murderers want to talk about their crimes, that they always want to talk about it, even if it is obliquely. And he believes that they give themselves away. He acts more foreign all the time, using lots of French phrases, though he's lived in England for many years, decades by a certain time. But suspects then tend to dismiss him as he's a joke. He's not really going to say anything. He relies on criminal psychology. And so he has some idea of that. And he talks about psychology all the time. Psychologists will probably disagree with the level of knowledge that Christie had and made her detectives have. But Poirot relies on figuring out what kind of a person, how does a person think. This is in contrast to the other big detective that she created, Miss Marple, who is just an amateur. She lives in a small village in St. Mary Mead, but unlike what most people think, that village life is full of simple, good-hearted people, Miss Marple begs to differ. Her belief is that you see all kinds of evil in villages. You'll see the crooked banker, you'll see the philandering clerk, you'll see somebody who's stealing a little bit. And she uses her memories of people and what she knew about them, and how one person today reminds her of someone she knew 30 years ago, and she says, he stole some money, but he's not the kind to commit murder. Now, the other guy, he reminds me of that man, the banker, who killed his wife 30 years ago. Yeah, I think this is murder. So it's a lot of it is intuitive. A lot of it is based on an analogical survey, if you will, of people that she's seen before. Miss Marple is not just confined to the village. She journeys up to London from time to time. That's how she was coming back on the, well, her friend was coming back on the 450 from Paddington. That's what she does. She goes to other parts of Britain, and later on in her life, even to the Caribbean, courtesy her author nephew, Raymond West, who is very fond of his Aunt Jane, and he helps her out. She's very Victorian in her tastes. She keeps talking about how men were so dashing and had long whiskers and mustaches back in the day. And nowadays, she doesn't like feminists. She doesn't like strong women, even though she is a woman and she knows more than the gentlemen, as she refers to them. She appears to give more power to the men. Her mind is like a sink, which is a good thing for a detective, because if you think the best of anybody, you're probably not going to get to the truth. Now, there's an interesting reason why people identify and like Christie, and it's people like Miss Marple, who's this fluffy lady going back to, she's knitting blue woolen sweaters half the time. And so you feel that, oh, I can relate to that. I have an aunt like that. I'm not really a man of action. It's much more difficult to relate to someone on a police procedural who's driving there, loses their stuff and drinks a lot and charges into the office and says, I'm going to shoot it out with somebody. We say, Miss Marple, well, okay. And you like reading about it. So Christie's, I think in many ways, when you're reading Christie, it's about comfort. It's a comforting thing. Tommy and Tuppence, the other two detectives I told you about, there's the husband and wife team. Tuppence is the more imaginative one, but sometimes her imagination runs away with her. Tommy is the more steadfast, quiet type, and he is more likely to come up with ideas and say, to question our ideas, but doggedly follow on a trail. He'll wait for proof until he acts. Tuppence won't. There's not their real names. His name is, of course, Thomas. Her name is Prudence Beresford, but she's called Tuppence for short. The Harley Quinn mysteries. Christie dabbled a bit with supernatural stuff, and this is one of those. We're never sure who Harley Quinn is, but we think he's someone he's a otherworldly person who comes out there to help lovers. And every time he appears, he's the catalyst for somebody else to solve the crime. He throws out a few questions that make people question what they had earlier thought, and crimes get solved. So that's a very interesting take. And one of the key people who works with Mr. Quinn is a man called Mr. Satterthwaite, an older person, a refined gentleman who, whenever Harley Quinn appears, he says, oh, I know something's going to happen. And every time Harley Quinn does this, there are some people who have been sundered apart because of a misunderstanding, or one of them is accused of murder. And the end of the story, mostly short stories, mark you in the Harley Quinn, they end with these people being able to get together because the murder has been solved and put to the right person. A few stories by Parker Pine investigates, a detective. He might be the only member of the working classes. I'm not sure he's working class, he's sort of lower middle class, but unlike Miss Marple, who is definitely upper middle class, and Poirot, who has a bourgeois Catholic education, but is considered to be now respectably middle to upper middle class, I think Parker Pine is not out there. He runs a detective agency. So he's one of the very few people in Christie's world that we find is not from a public school background where you went to one of the better schools, or you have an automatic knowledge of opera and French and German words can be used to pepper your conversation with sophisticated things. He's one of those few who's not like that. So why is Christie so successful? And I've thought a lot about it, and I said, she's simple to understand. It's simple. It's not very much. Her characters don't speak for pages and pages and pages. Dorothy Sayers did that. Marjorie Ellingham did that. Even Conan Doyle, sometimes the introspection that a character has going on in a Sherlock Holmes book goes on forever. She has like, did you do that? Yes. Are you going up to the lodge? I will be going there tomorrow. It's easy to read. People around the world can relate and understand that. There's also a lot for a reader to pick up. If you want to challenge yourself and see if you can pick out a clue in advance, she throws them around, which was one of the tenets of detective fiction in the 20s and 30s. You left sufficient clues that someone who's reading it should be able to spot who's the murderer. I'm not very good at this, though I have spotted a few key points in the rereading of the book. Ah, yes, this is what he saw. But other people have liked the fact, they relished the fact that when Christie wrote some of the stuff, they were able to pick up on it and said, oh yeah, okay, I knew who the murderer was, at least I have some idea why it took place. I already talked about the comfort. Christie is like, it's not, I was trying to read Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I haven't finished it yet. I saw the movie, and there's a lot of gore and torture and stuff in books like that. There's also this feeling of what's happening. In Christie, it's more like, all right, the murder took place. I'm sorry for the person who died, but quite often that's not such a wonderful person. Or their death is actually going to help some people, but we don't want the wrong people to get arrested. So um, I think of reading Christie the way Julie Andrews sang in that song. When I simply think of some of my favorite things. So Christie is one of my favorite things. Read a Christie, you feel automatically a little more cheered. And at the end, there's an explanation. If you didn't manage to get everything and you're like, I don't know what the hell happened, how did they get it? Don't worry. The detective will explain in 3 pages. Hercule Poirot loves an audience. He calls them and he goes over the case from the beginning to the end. Miss Marple will say it for the benefit of those of us who couldn't figure out what the hell was going on anyway. So everybody talks a little bit at the end and it's explained to us. That's very satisfying for lots of people. In her plots, death is always there. Murder by stabbing, very often by poison, maybe by a heavy blow to the head or something like that, occasionally by gunshot. But it's not used very often. There's not, with the exception of one scene, bodies are not distorted in death. There's been a couple where someone took poison and you can see the pain on their face that they had gone through. But other than that, for the most part, people look peacefully poisoned. They haven't suffered too much. The death has been quick. It has not been drawn out or long or anything like that. Most of our books begin like a play. You get to meet the characters who come in, say a line or two, and you say, this is the nephew who's come down from London. He doesn't appear to have money. He wants his aunts to give him something. Oh, who's this girl? Oh, she's in love with this other guy. I see. They're waiting to get a bequest. Okay, this is the house. And so it's a setting, and it's a good introduction. It provides a very simple venue for people for the reader to understand what's going on. There are some books where things are very complex. You have no idea who this character is, what are they doing. It doesn't happen much in Christie books. You're introduced to different suspects. There's a romantic liaison, as I said before. There's always a bit of romance thrown in. In fact, one of the things you may know about Agatha Christie is that under pseudonym, nom de plume, Mary Westmacott, she wrote a large number of books of romantic fiction. So it was in her to do that, and she's brought it out in most of her crime fiction as well. Evidence-based deduction is what is relied upon. I'm borrowing something from Sherlock Holmes, which has now also been used by Mr. Spock in the Star Trek series, which is when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever is left, howsoever improbable, is the truth. And that's a Holmesian dictum, but Hercule Poirot uses it. Eliminate, eliminate, eliminate what is not possible. Then look at what is there and figure it out, which is the most likely. And of course, I will have to say most of the detectives rely on a process of testing. They often put the potential criminal in a situation where they will reveal themselves by their action or by words or something, maybe a jarring shock, maybe a belief that a dead one is speaking to them again, something like that. This is why Agatha Christie is also popular. The first one is actually her house, a Greenway, which is now a National Heritage Trust building. This picture doesn't do it justice, because on the other side, the River Dart flows, and this house is visible from far on the other side of the other bank of the river. Christie bought it, and then it was requisitioned during the war, and then she reclaimed it again. Many of the Agatha Christie Poirot series with David Suchet were shot here using this house. The middle one is the dig, one of the archaeological digs, and it's more or less what happened in modern Mesopotamia. That's the setting sort of what you would have seen there. And then the final one out here is the Murder on the Orient Express, the railway train. They used one carriage. The 1974 film was very well done. And one of the ways in which they talk about low levels of technology, when they wanted to show the motion of the train, the director got a few extras to push the carriage manually to simulate the noise of the train, the motion of the train moving. So Christie, how would we sum her up? Her plots they're good plots, they're great detection, there's a good reading of human psychology, fantastic descriptions of how people are feeling, what are the emotions. And sociologists would enjoy taking a look at the British upper middle class. Other classes find short shrift. She's very traditional. She's a very ambivalent attitude towards women. Women play starring roles in many of her books, but they seem to settle for domesticity. And Christie doesn't seem to like women who are very intelligent. One of her major characters, who's a detective almost, she gets a first in mathematics at Cambridge. That's pretty good, getting first class honors in mathematics at Cambridge. But then she becomes a housekeeper because she didn't find it challenging enough. And I said, you're running down women in a really big way. On the other hand, she has a lot of women who live by themselves. Miss Marple is a detective who's far smarter than all the men around her. So I'm not exactly sure where she was going. I think, of course, she was a traditional woman from the 1920s who was finding it difficult to relate to a newer, more individual, more independent-minded, autonomous role for women in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There's not much discussion of poor people, of people of color, about women's lot, nothing. There are philosophical discussions about some things, but they are small about what would you be doing if you could do something, but they're never about anything going on. Maybe a quick mention, the war was going on, nothing more than that. But at the end of it all, there's class. Christie was obsessed with class. And you can see all aristocrats get murdered, they do not murder. Lord Edgware dies. The Duke of so-and-so might have committed a crime like stealing something, they're let off. Many of her characters show a tremendous amount of sympathy and tolerance for the upper classes, which you wouldn't find nowadays. Christie herself, being a member of those classes, moving about there, did have a line in one of her books, which G.K. Chesterton also had in one of his books, showing how people, he said, nobody came into the house and a policeman had come by. So, well, yeah, that is just, no, or a postman. Well, a postman is somebody. But we think of them as nobody. That's why the person says nobody came to the house that day between 5 and 7. The postman, oh, the help, we don't count those people. So this is wrong in so many ways, but she got better over the years. The servants went down, reflecting Britain's more democratic, less feudal attitude in the post-World War II scenario. And working classes never made much of a mention in Christie books. There were joint families, people living in these big houses well into the 1960s, people living in a big house, supervised by a patriarch or matriarch, and they're all waiting for this person to die, hence the murder. This began changing towards the end when she had people going abroad to the Caribbean. So you have some idea that there are other countries that people behave differently, and that the English gentleman is not someone who's to be saluted all the time. In the summing up, Christie's are great reads. They are comforting. The plots are good. How the crime was solved does take up a lot of your comprehension. It does give an insight into Britain between the 1920s and 30s, which is where she's most accurate. After that, it's her impressions. It's sort of a nostalgia and regret. What are we doing nowadays? What's all this? She makes no secret of her disdain for the Labour Party and the socialistic policies that they brought into Britain post-war. And finally, I love reading Agatha Christie with a cup of cocoa or hot chocolate, and you're in good shape. So I'm going to end here, and I don't know what the protocol is for questions and answers. My host, my co-host, Jen Camden, said that—
Here at last. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Thakar, for a wonderful talk, and thank you all for your patience with our technical difficulties. the good news is that tonight's meeting has been recorded, and so I also will be checking it out on the website to watch the first 10 minutes that I missed. So that will be up in the coming days at the same website where you registered. And also there, if you scroll down a little further, you can download the commemorative bookplate and bookmark designed by art education senior Ashley Andry. She has done such a great job in capturing many of the clues in the book without giving anything away. So I hope that you'll enjoy having those as kind of a souvenir of our course together. I will open it up for questions for Dr. Thakar. As I've mentioned previously, Dr. Thakar was the inspiration for choosing Christie. He asked several times when we do Christie for Communiversity, and when I discovered that Mysterious Affair Styles was published in 1920, I was thrilled to be able to say yes, and I'm so delighted that he volunteered to share his deep love of Christie and knowledge with us tonight. So with that said, I'll open it up for questions for Dr. Thakar.
Hi, Dr. Thakar. I have a question for you.
Sure, go ahead.
So you mentioned that the American titles of Christie's books were not that creative. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why they changed the names to begin with. Was it just because they were afraid Americans just wouldn't understand the references? Like I know, that it happens with Harry Potter and other books as well. So I didn't know if that was it was as simple as that or if there was something else going on.
I think it was as simple as that. Sometimes it's, I don't understand why they did it in the case of the Orient Express, because that is definitely a more captivating title than Murder on the Calais Coach. Orient Express would also be better known than a Calais Coach. Calais is just a small town that you cross over. So why would you do that? I'm wondering whether Taken at the Flood with its dramatic references to Shakespeare was probably more prevalent in there is a tide sounded more dramatic in the United States. I don't know. I've written emails on and I've gone on for online forums and said, why do they do this? And I think I've been dismissed as some sort of crackpot. So I stopped doing that now. It surprises me, by the way, when they make changes. Also, the other thing that happens is when they dramatize this and put them into movies and TV shows, they change the names of characters. And they change it to a very small extent. So Mr. Legrand becomes Legard. So why did you do that? Both the names are equally okay. Why would you do that? And they just change the name of a character. They change what he was doing. He was in the army, now he's in the Air Force. So why are you doing that? I have no idea. Maybe I suspect that the writer wants to throw a little bit of themselves, the screenplay writer, and say, look, I twisted it a little. This sounds more contemporary, something like that. But I must confess, I'm in the dark because I think they're doing it a disservice. Taken at the Flood is such a brilliant title. It's Brutus saying that when they are about to go to war. He says, there is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood. But instead, they said, there is a tide. We know that. There's also Hurricane Katrina. Don't go on about the bloody weather. So anyway.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes. Please go ahead, Carol.
I think I have an idea why they didn't use 10 Little Indians. That's more of a British rhyme than it is an American one.
With the original, they changed it even in Britain. The original title was, 10 Little, they used the N word. That was the nursery rhyme, which was very popular. Mm-hmm. Then they made it 10 Little Indians in the 60s, hoping that this will satisfy people. But then by the 80s, they said, look, this is pretty horrible. So please change it. And so they changed it to, and then there were none. The only problem is I wish they'd done something else, 10 people on an island or something like that. By saying, and then there were none, you've sort of given the game away, haven't you? So it's like, oh, thank you. We now know what happened.
Every time they tried to make a movie out of it or a play, they gave it a happy ending.
Yes, which was, I've not been very satisfied with many of the movie adaptations. I think David Suchet's Poirot and the associated MARPLE series on TV have probably been the most faithful adaptations. Mm-hmm.
Well, I appreciate highlighting how much you've highlighted how she wasn't quite a feminist, because I've been quite an Agatha Christie fan my entire life, and I never took that away, because I'm like, look, here's this amazing writer, and it's a she, and she's done all of this, and Miss Marple, she's smarter than everybody else, and I always took it very empowering. So just sitting here and listening to this, I'm like, well, I guess maybe hindsight it wasn't.
Yeah, I feel bad about the fact that Christie couldn't move beyond that. She seemed to have a sort of dislike. I mean, she's got some women who are independent women. There's one of them, there's a book that she's an artist. And when she loses the love of her life, she just keeps making the sculpture. She said, that's all I'm going to do. And she's independent. She doesn't require a male in her life. She can do whatever she wants. But this was not a sympathetic character. This is not someone that the Christie says you're supposed to like. So it's pretty clear where Christie was in all of these things, which I find a little surprising for someone whose first husband left her, and second husband towards the end of his life was carrying on an affair with his secretary. The moment Christie died, he married her. Of course, he died 2 years after that, but anyway.
Are there any contemporary writers that you really enjoy, that you feel have the depth of writing ability that Christie did?
I haven't really read much modern crime fiction, because I find it, well, one problem is, as I've gone up the academic ladder, I have less bandwidth to read stuff, and I end up reading stuff which helps me sleep well at night. So I'll read something from medieval history, because that'll put me to sleep very well. I'll be quite happy. It's very interesting, but it'll put me to sleep well. Christie is very easy. But many of the modern writers, they write with a lot of gore and killing and torture, and I don't. It's the same reason I stopped watching the news since November 2016. I just don't want to be depressed. I get it all off the internet. Reading Christie is more like a soothing balm. It's like, all right, let's go to St. Mary's Mead, this village. I shall have a cup of hot chocolate, maybe a splash of brandy in it, and away we go by the 4:50 from Paddington.
So we have one more question. How much control did Christie have over her works? Do you know, like, we're talking about name changes and adaptations of her book. Do you know, was she very involved in her writings after they've been produced and distributed?
She did have some issues with, she did not like sending them to film. She thought that they botched up them. So the murder of Roger Ackroyd was made as Alibi in the late 1920s, and it was not done very well. And she was very suspicious of filmmakers after that. I think one of those that she had been okay with was Witness for the Prosecution, which is a short story made into a film with Marlene Dietrich. And she was okay with that, but she was very suspicious. With the book titles, I don't think it mattered very much to her, because in the Commonwealth, in the British Commonwealth, which is where the bulk of her stuff was at those days being sent out, Britain, Canada, Australia, India, Pakistan, etc., it was the title that she wanted, that she had come up with, which went. But in her lifetime, she didn't go about allowing many movies and other things to be made. It's only after she passed away that we see all of these things happening. Murder on the Orient Express was made in 1974 while she was alive, and it was done very faithfully. They chose the characters well, they got it right. And I also think that Albert Finney, despite the fact that, he didn't have an egg-shaped head, but he played a very convincing Hercule Poirot, as well as David Suchet in some ways.
Thank you.
Sure. If you get a chance of it, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I've got another one for you. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the global distribution of her books, and if that had any impact, or what impact that had on foreigners' understanding of British culture at the time that she was writing.
Agatha Christie shares space with another one of my favorites and someone who is also very popular, but a little dated now, P.G. Wodehouse.
Yeah.
Okay. And P.G. Wodehouse and Christie, you see a little crossover. Some of the early Christie characters in the 1920s books sound like characters from P.G. Wodehouse. The butlers and valets and other people, they use similar terminology and say, I say, old boy. I say, what's up, and stuff like that, which changed over the years. They went away. But a lot of people around the world would think that this is the way British people talked, and they would use some of the slang that people used out there, particularly schoolboy slang and stuff like that. I remember growing up and thinking this is the way people spoke in Britain. So I was in for a rude shock when I saw more contemporary films in the 80s and 90s, and I said, they don't seem to speak like that at all. They speak a very different kind. Very, very few people speak that way. So Christie, of course, was in that world, and she did not participate in the working classes or anything, so there's no knowledge of. In that sense, she portrayed a very different image. On the other hand, who was reading Christie around the world? Not the working classes in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Malaysia or Zimbabwe. It was middle to upper middle classes who had been taught in English. Mm-hmm. And therefore, for them, it was like, yeah, we understand. Part of the reason I love Christie as well as I came from a similar background. Growing up in India, we had servants, not as many as Christie did, because we were just ordinary middle class people. But middle class people in India can afford servants, domestic help, because it's a way for people to get to survive. They get food to eat. If they work in someone's household, they work for a wage, and that was very common. So we were quite familiar. This sort of fit in. There's lots of sociologists have commented that Britain and India sort of fit in beautifully because both conqueror and conquered established class and caste systems which dovetail very beautifully. So they both understood, yeah, this is where are you in the pecking order? So we understood that, and we said, yes, of course it makes sense. You would have to marry someone from your own class because otherwise, how would you get along? Of course, much of that has changed. Society has changed in both Britain and India in so many different ways. But many people in the developing world could identify with the Britain of the 20s and 30s because their countries were similarly traditional, similarly class-based and divided, and similarly non-feminist. There was no talk of, they wanted like clean-cut books. Your parents would say, read Agatha Christie. I don't think parents would tell kids who are like 10, 11 years old, you read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. That's great. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Absolutely. If you get a chance, I would suggest that you do read one book by each of the detectives. So Miss Marple's best is, I believe, A Murder is Announced. It's a really good one. And I thank you, Catherine. I also really enjoyed the book by N.R.M., which is Tommy and Tuppence. That was really well done. It's got a bit of an adventure to it, but detection. The key part is, in a lot of books nowadays, somebody had asked me a little while ago, modern stuff, I don't find very much detection because it's procedure. It's a lot of police procedure. So, you know, it's like the routine stuff. Get the fingerprints, look at the cameras, was there anyone come and question them, get them to trip up, hold two prisoners together, one of them will squeal. Where is the detection that I think someone did this? Why would they do this? What is the motivation? That's the key part of the detective fiction of the 20s and 30s, that there was actual detection going on. You're trying to mentally figure out who did the crime, why did they do the crime, how did they do the crime. I have a question here. What do you think she was doing when she disappeared for a few days? I don't know. I mean, I'm 50-50 on this. When Agatha Christie disappeared, I think she did really get angry with her husband, and she probably just said, I'll show him. I don't think she realized that the police would be scouring rivers and places for her dead body, that it would become such a huge thing. I think she just thought that I'll go away, you'll be frightened and say, where the hell is Agatha gone? I think that's what was in her mind. Now, she couldn't bring herself to admit that, because had she said, I was just angry with my husband, people would have said, no, you're also getting publicity for your book. And yes, you got enormous publicity for Murder of Roger Ackroyd. So I think it developed into something that she did not anticipate was going to happen. So. Is it? Yes, Alan is telling us about an interesting movie from the 70s starring Dustin Hoffman and Vanessa Redgrave. And I saw that film. I saw that film just about the time I'd started reading Agatha Christie. I saw it in 1983. I'd started reading Christie for 2 or 3 years before that. And it was a really good film. I think it was 1976 or 77. The year after she died is when it came out. Netflix had a film about Agatha Christie actually solving a murder at the height of this crisis. I forget the name of the film. You can look it up, just Google it. It came out a year or so ago. I was in Edinburgh with Jen, and I switched on my Netflix account, and there's this film about Agatha. I said, Agatha Christie solving a murder? All right, this sounds really fantastic. And so, what is this, Abigail? What is this, The Unicorn and the Wasp? Is that the name of the?
No, but there was a Doctor Who episode where they do a movie with, they run into Agatha Christie at a manor house, and it explains what happened to her.
Yeah, the manor houses are something I've been interested in, and also railways. There's a lot of railways used, and I love railways. But going to manor houses, you get a feel of what life was back then. When you went up and downstairs, and then there were the servants' quarters in a different place. I got to visit a manor house in near Warrington in the Midlands in 2003, and it was like being transported back into the 1930s. They were readying it up for an event to take place a little later, and it was fascinating that you walked around and said, oh, this is what it was like. Gosford Park did a really good job of showing the Agatha Christie world as it would have really been. In reality, what would it have been like? And it was some disillusionment, but also a lot of humor in there. There was the disturbing thing that there were people such as different members of the household who were openly being sexually intimate with the domestic help, who were unable to do anything. You couldn't just say, go away. The one character did at one point. But I think that was a really good film to get an idea of what kind of life was being led in reality by the Christie characters. And I sort of added it onto what I already know from Christie.
I can't remember the exact title, but I believe it's something like Agatha Christie, The Truth of a Murder. But yes, it's on Netflix, and it is hysterical to see Agatha Christie playing Sleaze.
Christie also has, people don't come off very well in many of her, certain people don't come off well. I mean, I'm surprised she's so popular in India, and I'm surprised that I like her so much, given the fact that she treated anything about India with, like, India was a place where people had Chota Hazri, which is the morning, this thing, and tiffin eaten at 11 o'clock, terms from India that they came back with. And they went and shot lions and tigers out there. It seems to have been nothing other than a big game preserve. No mention of Indians. There's one Indian student who shows up in a later book in the 1960s, and when the police go through his room, wondering whether he's done anything, they find pornography there. I said, great. You have one Indian, and you load him with pornography. Quite possibly true, because he came to the United Kingdom and said, okay, this is legal out here. But I said, it's like Apu in The Simpsons. You have one character and you make him sound ridiculous. Have two, and then you can do that. And her treatment of Africans was really bad. There's an African character, like from some African colony, a former colony, who was at university, and he was simple. Stuff had to be explained to him. And I said, you're now really showing the times that the 1920s, this would have been perfectly acceptable. There are people running countries and doing a pretty efficient job of it in Africa, so I wouldn't do that. Then there was casual racism. I think one of Hercule Poirot's books, he says, yes, the head there unmistakably, or something, the head or something, unmistakably Jewish. A Jewish girl is called the Jewess with the ESS. And I said, why does it, you're not referring to Anglicans or Catholics in the same vein. But Greeks, Jewish people, they came up, they were always shown to have certain speech patterns, things like that. But she never got over it.
Any other questions for Dr. Thakar? Oh, Patty, I think you're still on mute.
Here I am. Well, this was just so interesting, and it's my first Communiversity experience. So my question is, have you ever taught your own course through Communiversity in political science or international relations?
No, I have not done that. I might think about it someday. I did think of offering a spring term course, which is the May semester that we have. And I thought of doing learning international relations through James Bond films, because they always—
That sounds fun.
Well, yeah, in the 1960s, there's a film, the 60s films have got the Soviets as evil people. Then you go into the 1970s, and because Détente had taken place, suddenly you've got James Bond prancing about with Barbara Bach playing a Soviet agent, and they cooperate with each other. They get along with people. I think staff can take those classes as well. You can definitely sit in. And then in the 1980s, the Soviets are back to being the bad guys. In 1991, James Bond film is, so something like that. I could even do something with Christie. The only problem is getting people to read Christie, getting our students today, undergrads, to read Christie books, monumental task. I would love to do it. But films are okay because students hold pillows, curl up, and go off to sleep. And they catch 10 minutes of the film. But getting people to read the whole thing and say, well, what did you think of the murder? I don't know. So I might tinker with that at some point. I've now reached a point in life where I feel I should be doing interesting things, not just teaching things about people going to war or things like that. The Poirot short story, Disappearance of, let's see, what am I getting here? I should check on chat. The Poirot short story, Disappearance of Mrs. Devenheim, references amnesia and what ends up being very interesting, considering what happens to her later. Yes, I agree. Yes, there's a reference of amnesia, and then 2 years later, because I think the book was written in, the story was written in 23, 24. And then, yeah. So you call it 10 Little Indians. I was used to the other one because I grew up in a very un-PC world where people use the first title that Christie used, and people still defend those titles passionately and say, it's not the same. No, the detection is still the same. You don't need such a strong title with reminiscences of racism. Has anyone seen the latest film, Murder on the Orient Express, with the one that came out last year or this year? Okay, I tried watching it. I've got it on my DVR, but I can't go any further. It's very, it seems almost a little action oriented. Carol, please jump in.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't like his Poirot.
I don't like his Poirot either.
However, I did like Linda. I think the person who played Linda.
Good job. Okay. I like books like these. I mean, even when I think of Sherlock Holmes, the ITV Granada made a really brilliant series, Sherlock Holmes, just called Sherlock, with Benedict Cumberbatch. Okay, but okay, it was wrapped up where pretty much all women and most of the men saying, Benedict Cumberbatch, we'll watch it. What a fantastic guy, great actor, great looking guy. But it was so bizarre that I said, I have a problem with showing all detectives, whether they're based on Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot, as being some sort of lunatics. I mean, Sherlock Holmes was not, he was just mildly eccentric. Hercule Poirot likes order. He's not a lunatic. So when they showed someone who's like Adrian Monk in the TV series, or the mentalist on the TV series was such an annoying guy. I said, will someone please throw him in prison for a little while just to shut him up? That's not what Poirot is like. That's not what, though in one book, Christie mentioned, and there was nearly a fifth murder, the murder of Hercule Poirot by Superintendent Battle, because he gets angry with him because Poirot says, it's so simple, I'm sure you'll figure it out. But barring that, they aren't that irritating. Yes, please, Ellen.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Now, I kind of thought the new version, I like the old version of Murder on the Orient Express as well, like much better.
Mhm.
I thought the new Poirot gave the essence of who she wrote about, even though he didn't look like him. So see if you, and I liked Michelle Pfeiffer was so great in that. And I don't know who played which parts. I know she played the bigger part in the role. So I don't know. I kind of, it took me a second viewing to realize kind of what they did with it.
I saw
It's
10
very
minutes. I saw 10 minutes of it and I said, okay, enough. I guess I'm a traditionalist at that. The one part I will give you is when Poirot found that he had put his foot in poop and then he put his other foot in it to balance it out. I said, that is Poirot. Yes, I can see him doing that and saying, yes, 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 they have to be equally dirty. But he would also have gone ahead and then cleaned it out immediately because he's so fetishistic about cleanliness and order. But there's a little more action, a little more lively stuff, more people running about, a crowd riot and stuff. That's not Poirot. That's not Christie. Christie is like, let's sit down, all of us here, and figure out who did it. But I'll give it a shot. I should. As a Christie fan,
You should.
I owe it to her to see what they're doing. If nothing else, I can provide critical things to the producers and say, don't do this again.
Exactly. And we're about to be able to critique Death on the Nile. That's coming in
Nile.
a few months. So
Yeah.
With Kenneth Branagh as Poirot. Whew.
Was that who?
Kenneth Branagh.
Yeah,
as Poirot.
he's a great actor, but I think that David Suchet, I thought, did a really good job in the TV series. I like those. I haven't seen all of them, and but they were really good. Miss Marple has been all over the place. There's a really popular tune based on the Miss Marple TV show, Miss Marple's theme, and I didn't know it was Miss Marple's theme, but I enjoy listening to that. But in one of those Miss Marple's movie series, she becomes a riding instructor at a girls' school. And she's riding around on a horse looking absolutely ridiculous. And I said, why? Why would you do this? Why couldn't you just stick to detection? Why do you have to make a figure of fun? Now, just for comparison, there are other British shows coming up now that I do enjoy watching. There's Broadchurch, for example, and there's Hinterland, which is set in Wales with everyone having Welsh names, speaking in Welsh accents, and the Welsh are saying they're basically preparing themselves for the day when they kick the English out, when they can afford to do that. But what I found really interesting out there is that they are not in the same vein as the Agatha Christie or the old British detective fiction. They are much they're much more gloomy. They're more close to Nordic fiction, Nordic detective fiction, in that they're grim. Well, if you live in Britain now, there's much grimness around with the disastrous decisions taken after Brexit, the mass unemployment that prevails in much of England, except in the southeast. So they're putting it in the right perspective. Christie wrote at a time, even though there was depression and stuff going on, Britain still had an empire. Even those symbols of empire could make people feel good, even if they didn't actually participate in something. And the British state still had some money to throw around here or there. That has since vanished. So there are no illusions left. And I suppose that's why people now prefer a much more pragmatic look at life rather than a more romantic look at life. Oh, well, hello, look who's there. Teddy.
I'm glad the only Zoom bombers so far have been my children. Emma is playing bingo for you all. You're getting a Camden family serenade here.
Oh, my dog is trying really hard to get it. He's down here, but he's small, but he's trying very hard. So I really enjoyed this. I could talk like this for hours about Christie, but I know we don't have that. So
I can talk hours over Christie as well. I mean, I really enjoy talking about different plots and stuff. I've read The Mysterious Affair of Styles about 3-4 times. I've read most of the Christie books 3 to 4 times. And some of them I've read many more. Murder on the Orient Express, I have 2 copies and I keep reading them. I really enjoy. It's like I said, it's like a soothing balm. And then, so I've been asked by my wife, but you know the ending. I said, yeah, but I like to see the reasoning again. When did he figure it out? What was that? And then you say, he looked up and he get this glimpse. And I said, wait, I'd forgotten that. Let's go back. And I love the descriptions. Coming back to this place or taking they announced first service, premier service for dinner, and the character speaking a little bit of French or something, and you're saying, the Riviera. What must it have been to be an upper class person traveling in the winter to the Riviera and then coming back to London in the summer for Ascot and the races? Nice. That was the life. Pity one has to work for a living nowadays.
I first tried to read these when I was around 12 or 13, and they were just boring to me. The covers looked amazing, but they were boring to me because I was too young to grasp what the real point was, which was the paranoia.
Sure.
More of an adult fear. Yeah. So I picked one up when I was around 23 and fell in love. And I've been reading them ever since. So.
Okay. I have a question from Catherine about what is my favorite Agatha Christie story. And it's a bit difficult. I feel a little bad about this because I really like HERCULE Poirot. I think he makes my day when I read about him. But I'd have to say that my favorite book it's changed a bit over time, but it's probably now A Murder's Announced. If it was, that's Miss Marple. If it's Poirot, then it probably is Murder on the Orient Express, just because I really enjoy, I like Poirot as a character. He has got all these ideas and he's not trying to build anything. One of his sayings is, I have a very bourgeois attitude towards murder. So this is being said at a time when some people said, kill somebody, that's a good thing. And he said, no, I don't like people being killed. I have a very bourgeois attitude towards murder, very middle-class mentality. Murder is bad. We'll catch whoever did it. There's been only 1 or 2 cases where Poirot has let the murderer walk. And I'm not going to reveal that because you should read it on your own and find out how it happened. And it was a brilliant detection. Murder is announced. It's not murders announced. It's a murder is announced. Yeah, 1950.
Mm-hmm. That's probably one of my favorite Miss Marples as well.
Yeah, it was intelligently done. I thought that there was there's a bit of nostalgia there, but they described post-war Britain, which was pretty gloomy, and how people just cheat the system and say, hey, you want some eggs? I could use some of your jam. So people keep trading their ration card coupons with each other.
Yeah.
And it also describes the number of refugees and flotsam and jetsam from Europe all over in Britain. So there's a Swiss waiter, and then there's a Central European woman who's a cook in a house, and there are other people like that. So it gives you the flavor of what Britain was like in 1950, and you suddenly realize this is more than the detection itself. The crime is very well done. The detection is fantastic. But I think what I also liked was a social commentary, which is not so powerful in some of the other Christies. So that's why I like Murder is Announced a lot. Do I still understand something new in novels having read? Yes. Do I still understand something new in novels having read them 3 or 4 times? I pick up things. I've read something more about about something that happened in that time of the world. I think in The Secret in Chimneys, there's a mention of the Spanish influenza. There's a mention of that. And I said, oh, because previously it was just like, yeah, some influenza, I know it happened. But now that we are living through something like that, you say, well, wait a second. Did this happen there? When I first read NRM, one of the characters whistles Lily Marlene. And I didn't know Lily Marlene until much later. I'm also really fond of reading books about World War II. Again, mostly growing up in a former British colony, I read them from the British angle, but Lily Marlene cropped up a lot. And I heard Marlene Dietrich's version, and I've heard Vera Lynn's version, and I thought Marlene Dietrich. So
Yes.
I learned it in the original German as well. I loved it. And I said, oh, that's a good tune. And you can never forget that tune. If someone whistles the tune, you'll know somebody who knows you. So, okay. Now I figured out why it's significant in the book as well.
I completely agree, because you just gain those experiences over life and you bring them back to the reading. And especially if you're a big fan and you go through this, like your initial phase where you just are getting your hands on book after book after book, you really dive in because you want to read another Agatha Christie book, and you miss some of those details because you're just so excited to have a new
Exactly.
one. Yeah.
I did that a lot. I read this book probably when I was 22, and I'm 40 now, and I breezed through them so fast in the early 20s, my early 20s, one after the other, basically just getting to the end, because I enjoyed the adrenaline rush that was happening.
Yes.
And going through now and detailing every chapter is such a different experience. I'm reading it completely new. So
yeah.
I didn't remember a lot of it to begin with.
I took some things for granted, and I said, yeah, it sounds like some sort of thing, but the internet helps to find stuff. So what's a charabanc? You hear them all the time in the 1920s, these big, it's a car with like 3-4 rows. It's like a bus, but it's really a long car in which they used to take people on tours in the 1920s. So I looked up a charabanc. I'd never come across that before. That once we have the internet, you can actually look the stuff up and say, oh, okay. With that, so that makes it, suddenly you now have a vision of what these people would have looked like, and you say, yes, okay. I traced the Orient Express journey and figured out exactly where they would have had the snowfall, and they would have been in Serbia somewhere. I said, okay, this is really interesting. So I love reading that.
I've enjoyed seeing across the forums discussions, many of you have talked about the difficulty of slowing down and only reading one chapter a week. So I'm glad, Alan, that you're finding it helpful to take a second look at books that I think we all want to know who did it. So
Completely different experience. Completely different experience doing it like this. I'm thinking so much more about what she's been writing than just trying to get from the beginning to the end. It's and I appreciate it more and her more. So yeah.
She used some plot devices which were very intelligent. I mean, in one particular case, the person realizes when she's staring into a mirror that she's using her right hand, but it shows up as the left hand. And somebody had mentioned that, and she says, oh, that person saw a mirror image, and she figures out. And the murderer, realizing that she's figured out, but when she's looking into the mirror, hits her, but is unable to kill the person. And so that's revealed only at the end, but she says something about, I looked in the mirror, and that is something that you figure, oh, what happened out here? There's another case of somebody walking into, somebody's asked, what day was that? And the person goes and looks at a calendar, crosses the room to look at a calendar and look at it from close. So later on, the inference is made, this person does not have good eyesight, so could not distinguish between two people who look similar. But I didn't catch it the first time. But later on, I said, that's what you were driving at. So there's small little intelligent plot twists. This is what makes her the queen of mystery fiction, detective fiction, is that she puts in small things like that, and they are well explained. I do think, for me, a very big thing was that, I mean, I know Jen Camden, Dr. Camden is used to her time period when she reads about the early 1800s, people spoke for 3 pages. And I can't do that. I can't wade through that. I mean, if it's Mark Antony making a speech, yes, by all means, because it's fairly dramatic. But otherwise, people are saying forsooth, and we went there, and oh, but isn't Mr. So-and-so going on? I was like, get to the point, lady. You're killing me here. It doesn't happen in Christie. People get to the point quite fast within a paragraph.
If there are no final questions for Dr. Thakar, we'll let him get on to his Christie and cocoa. But thank you so much, Milind, for coming to share your expertise with us.
Okay. My pleasure.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.